Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling instances in Missouri Ozark history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. The locations and times of day or night that these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. A sequence of events that would be buried in county records for decades began in the Little Missouri Ozarks community of Hollow Creek in the fall of 1891. Eliza and Ruth Blackwood ran a small boarding house on the outskirts of town where tired travelers and laborers from the surrounding mines would come for a hot dinner and a place to sleep. The sisters were renowned for their warmth and their filling stew, which visitors said tasted like nothing they had ever eaten. However, what started out as local rumors would eventually result in one of the most unsettling investigations in the history of Douglas County. In order to take advantage of the abundant natural resources found in the Ozark Mountains, farmers and timber workers founded the hamlet of Hollow Creek in 1843. With about 300 people living there by 1891, it had a modest main street with a church, post office, and general shop. Homesteads and small farms were scattered across the neighboring hills, which were divided by thick oak, hickory, and pine forests. These properties were extremely isolated, particularly in the winter when travel was practically impossible due to snow and ice. Arriving from Tennessee in 1846, the Blackwood family was one of the first people to establish there. Samuel Blackwood bought 80 acres about 2 miles from the town center, according to county records. The property was adjacent to what the locals referred to as the Devil's Backbone, a particularly steep and rocky ridge that sliced across the terrain, and it included a natural spring. Raising their kids in relative isolation, Samuel and his wife Martha rarely attended neighborhood gatherings and had little interaction with their neighbors. Sheriff Thomas Hargrove's observation of an odd pattern was the first clue that anything was wrong at the Blackwood boarding house. 7 males who had registered at the establishment were reported missing by family members or employers between March and October of 1891. Examining the ledger revealed that each individual had stayed precisely 1 night before to their disappearance, which was how the common thread was almost accidentally found. The fact that none of their possessions were ever found again was even more odd. There was not a single pocket watch, bag, or even a cap to indicate they had been there at all. William Jennings, a cattle buyer from St. Louis who had been passing through the area buying livestock for eastern markets, was the first person to go missing. Jennings arrived in Hollow Creek on the 17th of March, 1891, according to documents discovered in the Douglas County Courthouse. That night, after doing business with a number of nearby farmers, he was last saw going into the Blackwood boarding house. 2 days later, his saddle and horse were found roaming about 5 miles from town, close to Bryant Creek. Sheriff Hargrove established a search party, but they were unable to locate Jennings. In April, the second disappearance took place. James Thurston, a Missouri Pacific Railroad mineral surveyor, allegedly spent the night at the Blackwood facility and neglected to report to his supervisor. At first, his group thought he had deserted, as sometimes happened with personnel sent to far-off places. Questions concerning his whereabouts only surfaced after his personal belongings were discovered at his Springfield office, almost undamaged. Thurston had indicated plans to investigate possible mining sites close to Hollow Creek, according to a coworker. His signature, dated April 23, was neatly marked with a check mark next to it in the boarding house ledger, suggesting that he would be leaving the next morning. A timber buyer, 2 traveling salesmen, a photographer who documented Ozark vistas, and a doctor who had recently opened a practice in nearby Ava were among the 5 other men who had disappeared under identical circumstances by July. The Blackwood ledger recorded their arrival and departure in each instance, but none of them were ever seen again after they had entered the boarding house. Despite questioning the sisters numerous times, Sheriff Hargrove was unable to uncover any evidence of misconduct. Their responses were steady, their demeanor composed, and their reputation in the neighborhood, albeit a little reserved, had never hinted at anything nefarious. The total hush surrounding the disappearances is just as disturbing as the disappearances themselves in this case. Nothing out of the ordinary was heard from the property, according to the neighbors. The sisters went on as usual, attending Sunday services, caring for their garden, and serving their meals. Sound seemed to be unable to travel through the air surrounding the boarding house. Eliza would simply display the ledger with the guests' departure dates, plainly marked always the day after their arrival, when asked about the missing visitors. In August 1891, Sheriff Hargrove recorded a statement from Martha Collins, whose farm abutted the Blackwood property, in his personal journal. Even though their houses were close by, she said she never heard the boarding house's usual noises, such as talking or wood being chopped. Her words, "It ain't natural." Even on still summer nights when sound carries for miles, that place is quiet as a grave. Only thing you ever hear is the dinner bell right at 6 every evening without fail. Locals characterized 7-year-old Ruth Blackwood, the youngest of the sisters, as reserved and infrequently spoke in public. Eliza, her 2-year-old sister, was the voice of their establishment and oversaw all business matters. Ruth would spend hours caring for a tiny plot behind the kitchen, where she produced vegetables and herbs, according to some who visited the place. They were intrigued by the fact that, in spite of the garden's small size, the sisters never appeared to buy meat from Jacob Winters, the neighborhood butcher. However, their stew, which was served to guests every day, was renowned for its unique flavor and thick, hearty quality. This oddity was pointed out by Winters himself in a remark made in late October 1891. He informed Sheriff Hargrove, "I've been operating the butcher shop here for 15 years. Every household in Hollow Creek buys their meat from me, except the Blackwood sisters." Asked Eliza about it once, she just smiled and said they have their own arrangements with suppliers further south. "Didn't make sense to me. Ain't no other butchers for 30 miles in any direction." The boarding house itself was a 2-story building, with the sisters' quarters, kitchen, and communal dining space on the first floor, and 6 guest rooms on the upper floor. The wooden frame, flanked by worn oak boards that had turned a drab gray, was set on a stone base. A split rail fence encircled the entire property, and the gate, which was never closed but made a loud squeak sound when it was opened, warned the sisters of visitors. A tiny smokehouse and root cellar, typical of rural homes of the time when food preservation was crucial, were located behind the main structure. If it weren't for Marshall Cooper, a railroad employee who stayed at the boarding house in November 1891, the probe may have remained unopened. Cooper, in contrast to earlier visitors, departed before breakfast, stating that an early departure was required. He returned to Hollow Creek 3 days later with some alarming findings. He had been unable to sleep throughout his visit and had seen Ruth in the middle of the night carrying something heavy to the cellar. The sisters' actions throughout dinner, more than the activity itself, were what most bothered him. Cooper's statement, which has been recorded in county records, states that they observed him eating with an intensity that caused him discomfort. "They didn't blink," he stated, "not once, during the entire meal." In hindsight, Cooper's declaration, dated the 12th of November 1891, offers more information that appears noteworthy. He said the beef in the stew that night was so soft that it crumbled under the weight of a fork, and the stew was extraordinarily rich. Additionally, he saw that Eliza replied to his praise of the meal with what he described as an inappropriate level of pride, claiming that they were quite picky about the food. Cooper's memory of the sisters' response when he revealed that he was one of 7 children from a large family in Illinois was the most worrisome. His words, their expressions, changed. Their generosity significantly chilled after that. They seemed almost disappointed. Sheriff Hargrove took a closer look at earlier disappearances after receiving Cooper's report. Each of the missing had been traveling alone, he found out. All had been described as strong or well-built, and the majority were unmarried men with minimal local connections. The pattern pointed to deliberate selection as opposed to chance. But in the absence of proof, the sheriff could only step up patrols around the boarding house and warn passengers to be careful. Sheriff Hargrove's rising skepticism is revealed in an entry from the 28th of November, 1891, in his journal. "Rode past the Blackwood place again today. Eliza was hanging laundry. Greeted me pleasant as always. Asked casual-like about business, whether they'd had many guests lately. She said things were slow with winter coming on. Yet I noticed smoke from their chimney at all hours, day and night. Someone's keeping a fire well fed in that kitchen." The date of the pivot was the 12th of December, 1891. The sisters had been cooped up inside for days while a powerful winter storm had descended upon the Ozarks. The butcher's cousin, Joseph Winters, a neighboring farmer, arrived on their door to ask for protection from the unexpected blizzard. He tested the handle and discovered it was unlocked when no one responded. For generations to come, Hollow Creek would be plagued by what he found within. On the 13th of December, 1891, Joseph Winters gave Sheriff Hargrove his statement. His experience is detailed in the written declaration that has been kept in the county records. I called out when I entered, thinking perhaps they hadn't heard my knock over the wind. The main room of the boarding house appeared normal, even inviting, with a fire still burning in the hearth. I called again, then moved toward the kitchen, thinking they might be preparing food. It was the kitchen that first raised alarm. I described a variety of knives, larger than what would typically be used for cooking, arranged meticulously on the wall. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the room with an aroma that initially seemed appetizing. However, when I approached, I noticed something unusual floating in the mixture, something that appeared to be a human finger. Winters hurried out to notify Sheriff Hargrove, who gathered a team of men to look into the matter. When they returned, the sisters were sitting quietly at the kitchen table, seemingly anticipating their arrival. When they were arrested, neither woman resisted. The magnitude of what had been going on at the Blackwood boarding house was made clear by the subsequent search. On December 12, 1891, Sheriff Hargrove and 2 deputies recorded the first search of the property. According to their reports, boarding houses appear to operate normally on the surface. Each bed had new sheets, and the guest rooms were tidy and well kept. There were no indications of conflict or violence in the shared areas. The terrible truth didn't start to surface until they arrived at the kitchen and cellar. Even the most experienced law enforcement officials would be shocked by the evidence found in the cellar, which was accessible through a trap door in the kitchen floor. Sheriff Hargrove's official report, submitted on the 14th of December, 1891, states that they found an area that had been transformed into a processing room. Drainage channels had been carved into the stone floor, and hooks hung from the ceiling beams. Along one wall, a workbench held a variety of tools, including cleavers and saws. Watches, wallets, boots, and other personal goods that matched descriptions of the missing men's stuff were among the most unsettling items discovered in a sizable trunk. Eliza apparently kept a journal in which dates, names, and weights were recorded, followed by remarks on quality and flavor. Recipes were written in a neat, meticulous style on the last pages. On the 24th of April, 1891, the day James Thurston vanished, the journal contained the following entry. Subject lean but muscular, approximately 175 pounds. Slight bitterness noted, possibly due to tobacco use. Will adjust seasoning accordingly for next preparation. The clinical tone of these notes suggested a troubling detachment from the humanity of their victims. Investigators found what seemed to be preserved human remains in the smokehouse behind the main structure, which was part of the search. According to Sheriff Hargrove's report, a variety of meat portions were discovered, meticulously wrapped in butcher paper and marked with dates. The human provenance of these samples was verified by analysis conducted by Dr. Samuel Wilson, the Ava doctor who had taken the place of the missing one. Historical scholars continued to disagree over what transpired in the months that followed. Several pages from the county courthouse archives are missing, making official records from the time period insufficient. All that is known is that the sisters were detained while they awaited trial in the Douglas County Jail. The case was covered by newspapers in nearby counties with a mix of morbid interest and terror. In January 1892, a number of articles in the Springfield Republican referred to the ladies as the Butchers of Hollow Creek. One of the most thorough reports of the case that the public could find at the time was published in the Springfield Republican on the 7th of January 1892. The piece on the main page, titled Horror in the Hills, Ozark Sisters Accused of Feeding Human Flesh to Unwary Travelers, detailed the case's wider ramifications as well as the community's horror. That such barbarism could exist within our civilized state, merely a day's journey from our own city, must give pause to all who believe in the inherent progress of mankind. The good people of Douglas County are left to wonder how many innocent travelers met their end in that quiet house, and more disturbingly, how many unknowing visitors to the region might have partaken of the sisters' infamous stew during community gatherings. According to a document found in 1965 while the old courthouse was being renovated, Ruth Blackwood may have given a statement to the police. Ruth characterized their childhood in the remote hills as a never-ending battle against starvation, especially during the hard winters after the Civil War, and said that their father, a hunter and trapper, had taught them that all meat is the same and that hunger knows no morality. Ruth's testimony offers insights into the sisters' early years that could help to explain, though not necessarily validate, their subsequent behavior. She explained how their father vanished for 3 days in the winter of 1866, when game was in short supply and food supplies had been exhausted. He returned with meat that kept the family going till spring. The sisters didn't find human remains buried close to their property boundary until years after his death. Instead of scaring them, this discovery seems to have normalized the idea that cannibalism as a survival strategy. It was discovered via additional research into the Blackwood family's history that Samuel Blackwood had served in the Confederacy during the Civil War. According to military documents, he spent many weeks in the winter of 1864 serving in a unit that was isolated from supplies. Veterans told one another that in order to live, some soldiers had turned to eating the flesh of their fallen friends. Although unverified, these reports point to a potential source for Samuel's subsequent actions. However, Eliza never provided a rationale for their behavior. She would sit there for hours, staring at the wall without blinking, according to visitors to the jail. According to his notes, the local doctor, Dr. Samuel Wilson, described her behavior as unnatural and disturbing, implying that she was suffering from a mental illness. It's unclear if this emerged after her arrest or if it was a pre-existing condition. Eliza Blackwood's mental state is mentioned multiple times in Dr. Wilson's medical journal, some of which has been kept in the University of Missouri archives. On this date, in 1892, he wrote, "Patient continues to exhibit catatonic episodes, alternating with periods of apparent lucidity. During these latter phases, she speaks normally about mundane topics but refuses to acknowledge the charges against her. When pressed about the evidence found at the boarding house, she simply states, 'Waste not, want not,' and returns to silence. I believe her to be suffering from a profound moral insanity, perhaps exacerbated by the isolation of her upbringing." A trial was never held in this case. A fire started in the Douglas County Jail on the 23rd of February 1892. 3 cells, including the one containing the Blackwood sisters, had been totally destroyed by the time it was extinguished. According to early reports, both ladies died in the fire, but because of the fire's intensity, their remains were never positively identified. According to Fire Chief Walter Brennan's official report on the jail incident, the sisters' cell block was where the fire started just after midnight. The entire eastern portion of the building was completely engulfed in flames by the time the volunteer fire department arrived. The jail's interior's wooden construction contributed to the fire's quick spread despite efforts to contain it. The Blackwood sisters were among the 3 prisoners who were declared deceased. The cell door was found open, despite protocols requiring all cells to be locked after 10 p.m., was one odd fact, nevertheless, that Chief Brennan acknowledged. This conclusion is called into question, nevertheless, by an entry discovered in Sheriff Hargrove's personal journal among his belongings following his death in 1907. Other entries in Hargrove's journal indicate that he grew more paranoid in the years after the fire. He wrote, "I cannot shake the feeling that they are still out there. Last night I dreamed of them standing at the edge of my property, watching my house. When I woke, I found footprints in the snow outside my window." 2 sets, side by side. He wrote about getting anonymous parcels with meat slices wrapped in butcher paper that looked familiar and of being monitored while performing his chores. It's uncertain if these encounters were genuine or just signs of a guilty conscience. According to some historians, Hargrove may have helped the sisters escape by bribery or compulsion and then lived out the rest of his life in fear of being discovered or punished. In the spring of 1892, the Blackwood boarding house was demolished. The locals insisted that everything be burnt and refused to salvage any materials from the building. For decades, the land remained undeveloped, and residents completely avoided the region. In 1923, workmen reported an extraordinary discovery. during a survey for a possible road expansion. They discovered a second cellar chamber down where the kitchen had been, which had not been discovered in the first inquiry. The fact that clothing items from the 1,870 seconds were preserved in this area suggests that the sisters' actions may have started much earlier than 1,891. The buried cellar is about 8 feet square, with fitted stone walls and a packed earth floor, according to the survey report submitted on the 12th of June 1923 by Harold Jenkins, an engineer with the Missouri Department of Transportation. Only a well-hidden trapdoor could reveal the entry, which had been hidden beneath what looked to be a sturdy portion of the main cellar floor. Although the contents had long ago degraded, Jenkins and his colleagues discovered shelves within that held dozens of glass jars carrying what looked to be preserved food items. The personal belongings, such as watches, eyeglasses, shoes, and other objects that showed more victims than those listed in the official investigation, were more unsettling. Jenkins also mentioned discovering a little leather-bound book tucked somewhere between the wall's stones. The book included handwritten writings from 1,873 to 1,890, which were likely an early version of the journal discovered during the initial inquiry. Water damage rendered much of the material unreadable, but snippets revealed a systematic list of victims that spanned almost 20 years. There is no formal record of the book's receipt in the archives, despite reports that it was sent to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. When historian Margaret Holloway started investigating the Blackwood sisters for a book on crime in the Ozarks in 1942, perhaps the most disturbing element of the case came to light. She discovered something shocking while looking through census records from 1,870 to 1,890. The Blackwood family had 4 sisters, not 2. According to the official records. Only hazy mentions of the other siblings traveling west around 1,885 were uncovered when Holloway searched for information about them. Neither woman's other records were located. The missing sisters are identified as Catherine and Mary Blackwood, who were born in 1850 and 1853, respectively, according to Holloway's research notes, which are part of the Missouri Historical Society's collection. Both were listed as residents of the family home in the 1880 census. Ruth and Eliza were the only ones left by the 1890 census. Holloway pointed out that the boarding house enterprise started at the same time that Samuel Blackwood passed away in 1883. Earlier in 1878, Martha Blackwood passed away from what local records characterized as a wasting sickness. After making this revelation, Holloway came up with the unsettling hypothesis that Ruth and Eliza might have started their pattern of behavior with their own relatives. When she discovered a record from a traveling salesperson who had been to the Blackwood residence in 1884, this theory received support. In his notebook, he wrote that he had met 4 sisters, and that they appeared tense in each other's presence. By 1886, when he returned, only Ruth and Eliza were left. Theodore Grant, the salesman, recorded in his diary on the 3rd of September 1884, called upon the Blackwood residence today to sell household sundries. Was greeted by the eldest, Miss Eliza, who invited me to take tea. 4 sisters present, though 2 seemed reluctant to join the conversation. Miss Catherine appeared particularly distressed, barely touching her food and flinching whenever Miss Eliza addressed her. When I inquired after their health, Miss Ruth explained that winter preparations had been taxing, an odd response, given it was still early autumn. On the 17th of August 1886, Grant wrote, "Return to the Blackwood home. Only Miss Eliza and Miss Ruth present." When I inquired after their sisters, Miss Eliza informed me they had moved on to better opportunities out west. She then offered me a bowl of stew, which I declined, citing a previous engagement. Something in her expression made me grateful for my hasty departure. In March 1943, Holloway's studies came to a sudden halt. She had come to Hollow Creek to look at the location of the former boarding home, according to her colleagues at the University of Missouri. She never came back after this journey, while her study equipment and notes were discovered in her abandoned car close to the site. Holloway herself vanished into thin air. After searching, the local sheriff discovered no signs of foul play. Eventually, her case was filed under the heading of Unexplained Disappearance. Concern concerning Holloway's disappearance is expressed in a memo dated the 12th of April 1943 From Dr. Robert Thornton, Department Chair at the University of Missouri. Ms. Holloway was one of our most meticulous researchers, not given to flights of fancy or careless behavior. Her intention to visit the Blackwood site was purely academic, part of her methodical approach to historical documentation. That she would abandon her vehicle and research materials is entirely out of character. I fear something untoward has occurred, though what that might be, after so many years have passed since the original incidents, is difficult to imagine. Local law enforcement and university volunteers participated in the nearly 2-week-long hunt for Holloway. Her scent unexpectedly vanished when tracking dogs followed it from her abandoned car to the location of the previous boarding house. Nothing out of the ordinary was found during a comprehensive search. However, several searchers claimed to have encountered unnatural silence on the site, as if the very air dampened sound. About 3 miles from the old Blackwood property, in a secluded cave, construction workers excavating for a new highway found a cache of human bones in 1952. The remains belonged to at least 9 people, according to forensic analysis. According to carbon dating, the death occurred between 1880 and 1895. More importantly, there were cut marks on a large number of the bones that were compatible with butchering methods. After a brief reopening, the case was quickly closed again without any fresh findings because all of the principals had long since passed away. Situated on what the locals referred to as the Devil's Backbone Ridge, the cave was nearly imperceptible to the untrained eye due to its apparent ceiling with boulders and bushes. Frank Miller, the engineering supervisor, wrote in his report, while clearing the proposed highway route, blasting exposed what appeared to be a natural cave formation. Upon closer inspection, we found the entrance had been deliberately obscured. Inside, scattered approximately 20 feet from the entrance, we discovered human remains. The bones were not arranged in any recognizable burial pattern, but rather appeared to have been discarded haphazardly, as if of no further use. Dr. Howard Mitchell of the Missouri State Medical Examiner's Office verified through forensic examination that the bones belonged to several people of different ages. His findings stated, cut marks on the larger bones, particularly femurs and humeri, indicate deliberate dismemberment using sharp implements. These marks are consistent with butchering techniques rather than ritualistic mutilation or medical dissection. Additionally, many bones show evidence of having been exposed to heat, suggesting cooking before disposal. Because of the fragmentary nature of the evidence and the passage of time, attempts to identify the remains were mainly fruitless. Nevertheless, James Thurston, the mineral surveyor who vanished in April 1891, was identified by a silver pocket watch discovered among the bones. The strongest connection between the Blackwood case and the cave finding was this one. Edwin Marsh, a retired postal worker, contacted the Douglas County Historical Society in 1968, marking the latest step in the Blackwood case. According to Marsh, who was in his 92nd at the time, he had brought mail to a secluded cabin in the Montana Territory in 1895 while still a young man. The 2 old women who occupied it, he said, looked very much like pictures of the Blackwood sisters in the newspapers. The finding of an ancient, leather-bound book among the belongings of his late wife was the reason for his letter after all those years. One of the handwritten recipes in the book was simply titled Special Stew. The Historical Society preserved Marsh's letter and the recipe book, but they were apparently lost in 1969 when they moved to new buildings. Marsh gave more information regarding his interactions with the women in Montana in a letter dated the 15th of January 1968. They lived in a cabin near the Bitterroot Mountains, far from any neighbors. I delivered mail there monthly for about 2 years. They went by the name Smith, but I recall noticing their acceptance of that name seemed practiced, almost rehearsed. They raised chickens and kept a vegetable garden, but also took in occasional boarders, always men traveling alone. I remember feeling uneasy in their presence, though they were unfailingly polite. The older one would watch me with an intensity that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I left that route in 1897 and never learned what became of them. Marsh found a recipe book with dozens of entries, most of which were for traditional cuisines of the time. But the special stew recipe called for odd ingredients and directions. Marsh describes it as requiring meat to be marinated in a blend of particular herbs and spices, adding that proper selection ensures tenderness. The recipe also included exact cooking times and serving instructions, stating that the meat should be presented with enthusiasm and observed closely for full appreciation. It is unclear how Marsh's wife came to possess this book. All he said was that somewhere in the 1,920 seconds she had bought a trunk of antique books at an estate sale in Helena, Montana. Had Marsh noticed the resemblance to the newspaper stories he had read decades before, the link to the Blackwood case might never have been established. Many Ozark residents still won't talk about the Blackwood sisters case, which is a troubling period in Ozark history. Only the ruins of a stone foundation and a small stand of trees commemorate the location of the boarding house, which is still undeveloped today. When passing the site, visitors occasionally describe an unusual silence that falls, as if sound itself is swallowed by the memory of what occurred there. In 1965, local resident Clarence Wilson spoke on the community's continued connection to the Blackwood legacy in an interview with a local newspaper. Growing up in Hollow Creek, we weren't told the details, just warned to stay away from that place. My grandfather would tan our hides if he caught us anywhere near it. Said the ground there was poisoned. As adults, we learned the truth, or parts of it anyway. Some things are best left buried, I reckon. But even now, folks around here won't eat at a stranger's table without knowing where the meat came from, and no one, and I mean no one, serves stew at community gatherings. It's still unclear what motivated two women to carry out such crimes. Some historians draw attention to the terrible realities of rural life following the Civil War, where hardship and starvation were frequent occurrences. Others propose more intricate psychological causes, possibly resulting from their solitary childhood or even traumatic early life events. We may never know the whole truth. In the 1,950 seconds, psychologist Dr. Eleanor Prentice examined the case and suggested that the sisters had a common psychosis that was made worse by their seclusion and perhaps early trauma. In a paper that appeared in the Criminal Psychology Journal in 1957, she stated, "The Blackwood case presents a fascinating example of folie à deux, or shared madness. It appears likely that Eliza, as the dominant personality, developed a pathological response to early experiences of starvation and possibly abuse. Ruth, the more passive sister, adopted these beliefs and behaviors as a survival mechanism. Their subsequent actions, while horrific, followed an internal logic consistent with their distorted worldview." The Blackwood case has only been brought up in specialized research on 19th century rural crime and has been mostly ignored in popular historical narratives. Maybe this obscurity is appropriate. Similar to how the sisters carried out their work in silence, their story has been reduced to whispers and is mostly found in local oral tradition and fragmented records. Perhaps the chilling view came from an elderly Hollow Creek resident in 1960 who was one of the few to discuss the subject. She informed a visiting journalist, "What they did wasn't the worst part. It was how normal they seemed. Eliza would bring her stew to church potlucks. Everyone complimented her on it. Everyone ate it. And all the while she would just smile and thank them for their kind words. Sometimes I wonder if we all knew somehow, if we all chose not to see what was right in front of us." This assessment highlights what may be the most unsettling element of the case: the sisters' capacity to blend in with the neighborhood while hiding their actual identity. The Blackwood sisters were able to carry on their activities for years by maintaining a facade of normalcy, in contrast to many infamous criminals who worked in total secrecy or on the periphery of society. While perpetrating unimaginable crimes behind closed doors, they continued to attend church, take part in neighborhood activities, and have seemingly normal relationships with their neighbors. Uncomfortable issues concerning the nature of evil and its capacity to appear in everyday situations are brought up by this dualism. "The sisters didn't look like monsters," she stated. People who research the case are still troubled by the fact that they looked like everyone else. This fact is more disturbing than the graphic details of their actions. It implies that the line separating depravity from normalcy can be more brittle than we would like to acknowledge. Although the Blackwood boarding house is no longer visible in the landscape, its shadow is still there. Residents of Douglas County's sleepy nooks, where the hills blend into one another and night falls early, continue to caution their kids against going too far from home. They talk in low voices about the perils that could befall them, not from paranormal threats, but from the more sinister sides of human nature. Even though the sisters are no longer with us, the lessons learned from their case live on. That sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those that hide in closets or under beds, but rather those that sit across from us at the dinner table and pass the salt with a firm hand and an unwavering look. What happened to the sisters themselves may be the more disturbing question, rather than what happened to the victims. Where did they go if the fire that was said to have killed them was a complex hoax? Even worse, did they carry on with their activities in another isolated area, away from the prying eyes of others who were aware of their past? Dr. James Randall, a historian who studied the case in the 1970 seconds, found that the Hollow Creek disappearances mirrored a number of missing traveler reports from the Montana and Idaho territories between 1895 and 1905. In each case, guys traveling alone disappeared as they passed through remote regions. The pattern was intriguing, even though there was no concrete proof connecting these cases to the Blackwood sisters. In his unpublished paper, Randall pointed out that the trail goes cold after 1905, either because the perpetrators ceased their activities, moved to an even more remote location, or perhaps finally succumbed to natural causes. Even now, some local families in the Ozarks still won't eat stew. Others continue the custom of never letting a single traveler remain alone and always entertaining guests in groups or couples. Even among people who might not be familiar with the specifics of the Blackwood case, these minor cultural adjustments demonstrate its enduring influence. As Sheriff Hargrove noted in his final diary post before passing away, some evils are too ordinary to be believed. We expect monsters to look monstrous. The greatest trick the Blackwood sisters ever played was looking just like everybody else. This may be the last word on the matter. The road that runs close to the location of the old boarding house is hardly ever used after dark these days. Longer routes that completely avoid the area are preferred by local vehicles. Some people say they can smell the perfume of cooking food on quiet nights, especially in the fall when the leaves have dropped and the trees are bare against the sky. It's a rich, meaty scent that makes people who know the area's past tremble. Ultimately, the Blackwood sisters case serves as a reminder that the most horrific moments in history frequently take place in the quiet nooks of everyday communities, rather than in the vast arenas of politics or conflict. Locations where no one considers taking a long look, asking too many questions, or wondering why visitors occasionally enter but never depart. In 1957, the Missouri State Historical Society archived the microfilmed records of the Blackwood case. However, much of those materials were destroyed in a fire that occurred in their storage facility in 1963. The only things left are echoes, pieces, and unanswered questions. And the most unsettling legacy of all may be that uncertainty. When Robert Thornton, an amateur archaeologist, was investigating caverns in the Ozark region in 1967, an intriguing side note to the Blackwood case surfaced. He found what looked to him like a rough stone altar in a small cavern about 15 miles from Hollow Creek. Dozens of tiny human teeth were placed in concentric circles around the altar. The teeth were dated to the late 19th century by carbon dating. Local officials pointed out that none of the victims who were identified had been reported to have dental problems or missing teeth, but they were unable to establish a clear link to the Blackwood case. In an interview, Thornton talked about how he came onto a metal cooking pot next to the altar. The remains of what looked to be a leather-bound book, mostly ruined by weather and time, were found inside. Thornton characterized it as a recipe of sorts, written in a clean, feminine hand on the only page that was still readable. Sometime in the early 1970 seconds, the paper and pot vanished from evidence storage after being given to local authorities. We are left wondering how many more Blackwood sisters might lurk in the shadowy corners of history as we wrap up this analysis of one of America's least well-known but most unsettling criminal cases. How many such monsters disguised as ordinary citizens still go about their business in the open, their actual selves hidden behind a facade of normalcy. And how often do we, like the people who live in Hollow Creek, fail to notice what might be in front of us? A historical commission was formed by Douglas County in 1959, with the responsibility of conserving local documents and artifacts. Organizing the disorganized archives kept in the courthouse basement was one of their initial endeavors. Volunteer archivist Emily Peterson found a little wooden box filled with Blackwood case-related objects that had never been formally cataloged during this procedure. A silver locket with the initials CB, which might have belonged to Catherine Blackwood, 3 human molars with gold fillings, and a hand-drawn map of the Hollow Creek region with numerous spots indicated with tiny red crosses were among the items found within. A sealed envelope addressed to Sheriff Hargrove, dated the 22nd of February, 1892, one day prior to the jail fire, was also found in the box, according to Peterson's thorough inventory. No one had ever opened the envelope. Upon carefully opening it, Peterson discovered a single sheet of paper with what seemed to be a warning in a beautiful script. "We have tasted what others fear to name. The hunger never leaves. By the time you read this, we will be smoke and memory. But remember, Sheriff, appetite is patient, and family traditions endure. Look to the daughters of daughters in years to come." At first, the mysterious communication was written off as an effort by Eliza Blackwood to agitate Hargrove ahead of her impending trial. But when local educator Sarah Collins unearthed previously unknown details about Ruth Blackwood's early life in 1961, the allusion to daughters of daughters gained new meaning. In 1877, at the age of 23, Ruth gave birth to a daughter, according to county birth documents Collins reviewed. The child, who was just designated as female infant Blackwood, vanished from later records, and the father was not given a name. Since infant deaths were frequent in rural areas at the time, it was presumed that the child had passed away in infancy. But in 1878, Collins discovered a baptism document for a child called Anna Smith from a Springfield church, in which Ruth Blackwood was identified as the mother. The name Smith, the same pseudonym the sisters allegedly went by in Montana, suggested that they were trying to give the child a new identity. We don't know what happened to this daughter. There are no other records of Anna Smith in Missouri archives, and efforts to locate her using census information have not been successful. If she lived to adulthood, she would have been in her 30s when Edwin Marsh claimed to have seen women like the Blackwood sisters in Montana, and around 15 when her mother and aunt are said to have died in the jail fire. Unsettling issues are brought up by the potential continuation of the Blackwood lineage. Did Ruth's daughter inherit her mother's tendencies? Did she grow up believing that cannibalism was commonplace? And might she have started her own life somewhere else, possibly transferring these family customs to future generations? Richard Blackwell, a novelist, visited Hollow Creek in 1964 to conduct research for a book that was largely based on the Blackwood case. He wrote in his own notebook, which was eventually given to the Douglas County Historical Society, about a number of strange experiences he had while there. Blackwell wrote that he was sleeping close to the old boarding house location on his 3rd night there when he was startled by what he described as a distant dinner bell ringing. He followed the sound to a clearing where he saw what seemed like a woman dressed in 19th century clothing caring for a big pot over an open fire. The person disappeared as he cried out, and when he arrived at the location, he saw no signs of a fire or cooking utensils. More important was Blackwell's encounter with an old woman he encountered at the neighborhood general store, who simply called herself Mrs. Smith. She took a keen interest in his studies and claimed to have ancestors from the area. She invited him to dine at her leased cabin so they could exchange family stories about the history of Hollow Creek, according to Blackwell's journal. Her demeanor unnerved him, and he turned down the invitation. When he asked about Mrs. Smith at the store the next day, the owner told him that no one with that name had been there lately and that no one with that name was renting real estate nearby. Shortly after, Blackwell left Hollow Creek without finishing his investigation and gave up on his project. His final entry in his journal reads, "Some stories are better left untold. I cannot shake the feeling that, in seeking the Blackwoods, I have somehow drawn their attention or the attention of something connected to them." The woman's eyes. There was hunger there, but not of an ordinary kind. When 3 hikers vanished in 1966 while hiking the Devil's Backbone Ridge close to the former boarding house site, the topic of potential Blackwood descendants received fresh attention. Only their camping gear and one of the missing men's journals were found after a thorough search. They met a pleasant, middle-aged woman who asked them to dine at her adjacent cabin, according to the last post. There was no sign of an occupied residence in the neighborhood, according to local authorities. At a conference on historical crimes in 1967, criminologist Dr. Lawrence Pritchard, who had researched serial killers throughout American history, presented his theory regarding the Blackwood case. According to him, the sisters were an uncommon instance of female serial killers who killed for pragmatic reasons as opposed to psychological gratification. The evidence suggests the Blackwood sisters viewed their victims primarily as resources rather than objects of desire or rage. Pritchard said, "This utilitarian approach to murder represents a different category of criminal psychology, one where moral prohibitions against killing are subordinated to a distorted form of pragmatism." Pritchard also pointed out how unusually long their illegal operations had lasted. If the murders began as early as the 1,870 seconds, as some evidence suggests, and continued until their capture in 1891, the sisters would have been active for nearly 2 decades, far longer than most serial killers, who typically escalate until capture or death within a much shorter time frame. This extended period suggests a level of calculation and self-control rarely seen in such cases. Additional information about the sisters' approach can be found in the boarding house ledger, which is largely preserved in county records. The names, origins, and arrival dates of each guest were kept in painstakingly maintained entries. Preferred victims seem to have been marked using a subtle coding system. A tiny dot next to some names, always those of lone travelers who fit the physical description of the missing. The idea that the sisters purposefully, rather than opportunistically, chose their victims is supported by their methodical technique. The geology of the region around Hollow Creek was surveyed by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources in 1968. They discovered a number of irregularities in the soil composition close to the former Blackwood property using ground-penetrating radar. 3 separate locations where the ground had been disturbed and then refilled were discovered during excavation. Technicians found a collection of human bone fragments and teeth buried about 4 feet below the surface in one of these sites, around half a mile from where the boarding house once stood. According to forensic analysis, these remains belonged to at least 4 people. All of them were male adults. The bone's distribution and fragmentation indicated that only the less attractive or inedible parts had been thrown away after being prepared for food. Additional proof that the sisters' actions before the documented disappearances of 1,891 came from carbon dating, which put the period of death between 1,875 and 1,885. It was observed that the soil composition around these remains was abnormally acidic, which sped up the disintegration process. The analysis's researcher, Dr. Senchen, Harold Jenkins, hypothesized that this might not have happened by accident. This methodical approach to disposal is consistent with other evidence of the sisters' meticulous planning. The systematic distribution of the remains and the soil chemistry suggest an understanding of how to dispose of bodies in a way that would hasten their breakdown and minimize the chance of discovery. This indicates a level of forethought and knowledge that goes beyond opportunistic killing. The coding method in their ledger, the remote cave cache, and the secret cellar room all suggest a planned operation intended to go undetected for as long as possible. Without Joseph Winter's accidental discovery during the winter, their operations would have gone unnoticed for many years. For many years, scholars have been captivated by the psychological aspects of the Blackwood case. According to Dr. Margaret Simmons' 1969 article in the Journal of Historical Psychology, the sisters' solitary childhood and traumatic experiences may have contributed to their particular type of shared psychopathology. The combination of extreme isolation, possible childhood abuse, and the normalized violence of the post-Civil War era created conditions where moral boundaries could be fundamentally altered, she stated. Add to this the real experiences of starvation and desperation, and you have the foundation for a completely reorganized value system, where human life becomes subordinated to survival. Simmons also pointed out that the Blackwood instance didn't seem to involve sadism. The evidence indicates that the sisters saw murder primarily as a practical affair, in contrast to many infamous killers who take delight in their victims' pain. There are no signs of torture or extended detention, and the victims seem to have been released promptly and effectively. In the study of serial killers, where emotional or sexual fulfillment usually plays a major part, this utilitarian approach constitutes an uncommon category. Another intriguing psychological study is the sisters' capacity to compartmentalize their actions to engage in public life while going about their somber business. They participated in neighborhood events without raising any red flags, went to church, and had ostensibly normal relationships with their neighbors. This ability to lead two separate lives points to either exceptional self-control or a significant break from accepted values. Over the years, the local folklore surrounding the Blackwood case has changed, adding features that make it difficult to distinguish between ghostly fiction and verifiable reality. By the 1970s, locals in Ozark were hearing tales of a stew woman who would show up to stranded hikers, provide them with food and shelter, and then vanish with the hapless traveler. Despite their lack of factual support, these stories show how the Blackwood case has become part of local legend. The ongoing claims of strange happenings close to the former boarding house location are more significant. James Thornton, a local, talked about hunting in the area as a young guy in the 1952. In an interview conducted in 1972, "I was tracking a deer just before sunset when I caught a whiff of cooking meat, strong enough to make my stomach growl. Following the smell, I came to a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd hunted those woods all my life. There was nothing there, no fire, no people, but the air was thick with the smell of stew. Something felt wrong, like I was being watched. I left my deer and walked straight out of those woods. Never hunted that ridge again." Over the years, similar stories have been documented, frequently involving the distant ringing of a dinner bell or the fragrance of cooked food without a known source. The regularity of such claims from people who were not aware of the specifics is remarkable, even though they can be written off as the result of imagination influenced by knowledge of the Blackwood case. Douglas County eventually placed a tiny historical plaque close to the location of the old boarding house in 1973. Cannibalism and specific crimes are not mentioned on the plaque. It simply reads, "Near this location stood the Blackwood boarding house, 1877 to 1892, site of several unsolved disappearances that remain among the most notorious criminal cases in Ozark history." There was disagreement among the locals about the plaque. Some felt that rather than turning into a horrific tourist attraction, the case should be allowed to fade from memory. The argument over whether or not to remember the Blackwood case raises more general issues regarding historical preservation, such as whether it is beneficial for communities to remember the worst parts of their past, or if it is better to let such things go unnoticed. One solution to this complicated problem is the compromise struck in Douglas County: acknowledgement without sensationalism. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, an anthropologist who researched the cultural ramifications of the Blackwood case in the 1972, observed a number of residual impacts on regional traditions. Even among residents who claim no knowledge of the specific details, there are behavioral patterns that appear to be direct responses to the Blackwood legacy, she stated. The reluctance to serve stew at community gatherings, the tradition of traveling in pairs rather than alone, and the persistent wariness toward strangers who express too much interest in local history. All these can be traced back to the collective trauma of the Blackwood case. Morrison also recorded the existence of what she called protective folklore tales and cautions that have been passed down through the ages and are meant to deter people from visiting the former Blackwood estate. These stories tend to focus on nebulous threats and unexplained disappearances, rather than specifically mentioning cannibalism. As a result, a buffer zone is kept surrounding the location without specifically addressing the horrifying incidents that took place there. Until 1975, when researcher Thomas Bradford found an 1,896 marriage certificate from Billings, Montana, the possible destiny of Ruth Blackwood's daughter Anna Smith was still up in the air. According to the paperwork, 9-year-old Anna Smith married rancher James Wilson. The bride's mother was identified as Ruth Smith, deceased. Although this is not the same Anna Smith who was born to Ruth Blackwood, the time and place fit Edwin Marsh's description of seeing Blackwood-like women in Montana around the same time. Through later documents, Bradford tried to track down Anna Wilson, née Smith, but was only able to locate shards of information. According to the 1900 census, James and Anna Wilson have a 2-year-old daughter and live on a ranch close to Billings. James Wilson is identified as a widower during the 1910 census. Neither Anna Wilson's death certificate nor any information on her daughter's fate can be found. Another troubling aspect of the case is the probable existence of a third generation of Blackwoods who would have been brought up with the same perverted ideals as her mother and aunt. The Blackwood sisters' psychological legacy might have lasted well into the 20th century if the mother-to-daughter transmission pattern had survived. During America's bicentennial celebrations in 1976, Douglas County reviewed all of its historical records, including the Blackwood case records. An unrecorded deposition from Martha Collins, the Blackwoods' closest neighbor, dated November 1891, was found by archivist William Stevens. Collins reported witnessing Ruth Blackwood perform an unusual ritual behind the boarding house prior to the sisters' arrest. Collins, who had been collecting hickory nuts in the woods next to the property border, said Ruth stood over a recently excavated hole, putting what seemed like tiny things inside and whispering something. After Ruth left, Collins looked around and discovered a pattern of human teeth encased in herbs and encircled by tiny animal bones. Collins told Sheriff Hargrove about this, but it doesn't seem like he took it seriously until the sisters were arrested. Robert Thornton's 1967 finding of teeth placed around a crude altar in a cave miles away from the boarding house is consistent with this story. Both imply that the sisters' actions have a ceremonial component beyond their use of cannibalism for survival. Uncertainty surrounds whether these behaviors were a psychological defense mechanism or a true belief system. Around the same time that the boarding house operation started, in 1978, Martha Blackwood passed away, marking the centennial of her life. A conference on the Blackwood case was arranged by local historian Edward Jenkins, who brought together scholars who had investigated different facets of the case. A number of novel theories regarding potential contributing factors to the sisters' actions surfaced during this meeting. Jenkins provided proof that since the 1852, medicinal herbs have been grown on the Blackwood site. Several plant species that are known to thrive in the region have been identified by botanical experts as having the potential to cause altered mental states or paranoid delusions when ingested in specific amounts. This suggested that long-term exposure to psychoactive substances, either through intentional ingestion or ambient interaction, may have affected the sisters' cannibalistic behaviors. The effects of the Civil War on Ozark villages were the subject of another theory. The widespread lawlessness and moral upheaval of the post-war era, along with Samuel Blackwood's service in a Confederate unit known to have endured terrible deprivation, may have produced circumstances where traditional ethical limits were ambiguous. According to this viewpoint, the Blackwood case is an extreme example of the psychological effects of the war rather than a singular anomaly. Perhaps the most controversial argument at the meeting was put up by psychologist Dr. Helen Richards, who hypothesized that the sisters may have first followed their father's example and turned to cannibalism out of true need during a particularly terrible winter. She suggested that once this taboo was broken, it would be simpler to defend the practice going forward, especially if it was presented as a survival strategy rather than a moral decision. A different source of interest in the Blackwood case, forensic science, resurfaced in the 1982. Researchers re-examined the bone pieces found in 1968 as a result of improvements in methods for examining human remains. Microscopic cut marks discovered by Dr. Thomas Caldwell of the University of Missouri provide light on the sisters' techniques. The precision of these cuts indicates knowledge of human anatomy and butchering techniques. he said. They knew exactly how to process a body for maximum utility. Caldwell also used bone analysis to find evidence of cooking techniques. The patterns of heat exposure are consistent with slow simmering rather than direct fire, he stated. This forensic evidence supported the notion that the Blackwood killings were deliberate and meticulous rather than frantic or spontaneous, and that this aligns with accounts of the stew as their preferred preparation method and suggests a culinary rather than merely practical approach to consumption. As time went on, the sisters seemed to have honed their particular methods of processing their victims. This methodical strategy clarifies how they were able to carry on their operations for years without being discovered. A leather-bound book that was remarkably identical to the notebook detailed in the initial study was donated anonymously to the Douglas County Historical Society in 1984. The handwriting resembled samples of Eliza Blackwood's script found in county records, but authenticity could not be confirmed. Although there were no overt allusions to murder or cannibalism in the book, there were some cryptic entries that might be read as referring to their actions. A similar entry from June 1884 said, "Selection remains the key. Quality varies greatly depending on habits and constitution. Those who labor with their hands provide the most nourishment, while those of sedentary profession often require additional seasoning to mask the lingering bitterness." A different entry from October 1889 said, "Winter's approach brings the usual concerns. Have prepared 12 quarts for storage. Should suffice until spring travelers resume." There were also what seemed like recipes in the journal, albeit the ingredients were frequently mentioned in passing. The autumn preparation item described a marinade of particular herbs that botanical specialists said would soften tough meat and cover up any off-putting flavors. These recipes' level of sophistication and precision revealed that the sisters saw their work as a culinary art form they had honed over time rather than just a way to make ends meet. The tone of the journal detachment, practicality, and a complete lack of moral reflection was perhaps its most unsettling feature. The author described cannibalism and murder preparations with the same casualness that one might apply to the description of curing ham or preserving vegetables. This lack of moral struggle or rationalization points to a total disengagement from traditional morality, a mental condition that led the sisters to carry out heinous deeds without seeming to have any conflict or regret. Criminologists, psychiatrists, and historians continued to be fascinated by the Blackwood case as the 20th century came to an end. It was a unique entry in the history of American crime since it involved female offenders, cannibalism, and the sisters' ability to keep up a facade of normalcy within their society. But there were still a lot of unresolved issues, especially about the sisters' final destiny and whether they had any children who might have continued their customs. Douglas County held a centennial symposium on the case in 1992, precisely 100 years after the jail fire that is said to have killed Eliza and Ruth Blackwood. Some of the discoveries and theories put up by researchers from a variety of professions contradicted long-held beliefs about the sisters and their crimes. Sheriff Hargrove may have been more involved in the case than previously thought, according to information presented by historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Mitchell proved that Hargrove had bought property from Samuel Blackwood in 1882, just before the elder man's passing, by examining land records and banking transactions. Neither the sheriff's official records nor his personal notebooks had ever noted this transaction. Furthermore, Hargrove's official pay was insufficient to account for the frequent deposits made to his account between 1885 and 1891, according to bank records. The sheriff's apparent guilt and paranoia in the years after the sisters' disappearance, as recorded in his journal entries, could be explained by Mitchell's suggestion that Hargrove may have been aware of their activities earlier than he claimed and may have profited financially from looking the other way. Mitchell refrained from directly accusing Hargrove of complicity in the Blackwood crimes. The issue of how the sisters chose their victims was also covered in the symposium. In his statistical examination of the known and suspected victims, crime analyst Robert Thompson found trends that pointed to deliberate targeting as opposed to chance. The typical victim was a male between 25 and 45 years of age, traveling alone with no local connections. Most were engaged in professions that required physical strength and endurance, such as laborers, farmers, or tradesmen. According to Thompson, the sisters seemed to steer clear of victims whose disappearance would garner a lot of notice or who would be instantly missed. They selected men who existed at the margins of society. He said, individuals whose absence might not be noticed for weeks or months, if at all. This wasn't merely practical. It reflected a predatory understanding of social vulnerability.